Let's take a look at U.S. foreign policy under Roosevelt. First, looking at the Western Hemisphere. Now, you'll all remember that under the previous Roosevelt and the other progressive presidents, Taft and Wilson, there had been a lot of intervention by the United States in the affairs of Latin American and Caribbean nations, that moral imperialism that Woodrow Wilson was especially known for. Well, there's a change in approach by the 1930s. There was a policy officially referred to as the Good Neighbor policy, which actually had been initiated by Herbert Hoover and was formalized and signed off on by Roosevelt when he took office. This policy was a reversal of that progressive tendency to sort of pry and enforce U.S. will on Latin American countries. No more interfering, or at least a whole lot less of it. Now, in part, that's because Roosevelt and Hoover before him had recognized that, yes, these nations are sovereign nations and should be allowed to handle their own affairs. Something that, remember what Wilson said? He said, "We will teach them to elect good leaders." So yes, there's a recognition that the nations are sovereign, but there was another issue as well, and that was the fact that Roosevelt, particularly as the 1930s went on and things were getting a little tense in Europe, wanted to counteract German influence in those Latin American countries. And again, that's not surprising because remember, when World War I was going on and the U.S. hadn't started getting involved in that yet, the whole Zimmermann telegram that involved Germany and Mexico. So this is an effort to prevent that. Prevent it how? By not making all those neighbors south of our border angry at us all the time. Particularly not by sending the U.S. Marines and other military in to these other countries and interfering in their affairs. Now, he also was supportive. Well, he was permissive to the point of often being supportive of some Latin American leaders who were not that great at, human rights and stuff like that, who were in fact dictators. Woodrow Wilson, remember, was opposed to dictators. He had this feeling that it was the duty of America to spread democracy everywhere. Roosevelt, I suppose you could say, took a more practical view. If there was a dictator in one of these Latin American countries who ruled the country with an iron hand and everything went the way that this dictator said, if that dictator was on the side of the U.S. and was in favor of things that benefited the national interests of the U.S., Roosevelt was fine with them. In fact, he famously said about one such leader, "He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Americans were even more isolationist after World War I than they had been before World War I. You'll recall it took some doing to convince America to get into the war effort then, and not all came aboard even at that time. And remember how the war turned out. It had been sort of disappointing and disillusioning, and so Americans after that were even more determined that they didn't want to get involved in any more of Europe's messes. Well, in addition to that, there was an element of ethnic pride as sides started to form up in Europe. A lot of people of German heritage and also a lot of people of Italian heritage, because remember, World War I, the Italians were on the Allies side. So anyway, a lot of individuals of those ethnic communities were supportive, if not outright supportive, at least sympathetic to those countries, at least during the 1930s before the fighting started. And there was also, in the 1930s, quite a bit of support for Hitler and for Nazism. Quite a few Americans, not the majority, but quite a few, were essentially saying, hey, Hitler's not so bad. Look at him. He's improving the economy. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism prevalent in the U.S. at that time. So the fact that he was targeting Jewish people not only didn't bother some people, it was a plus. Also, a lot of Americans had invested in Germany in the 1920s when the German economy was in a shambles and they were so reliant on American money. A lot of U.S. businesses had opened branches and entered into partnerships with Germany. So the people who tended to support Hitler often were involved because they had business interests or they were extremely, not even necessarily extremely, they were on the more conservative side. They were on the right side, which means that they particularly hated the left or, the extreme left, communism. So if Hitler is opposed to communists, that's a great thing. The idea that if Germany does get out of line or get too ambitious, then probably what's going to happen is the Soviet Union and Germany will be fighting each other, so who cares? A lot of famous Americans were among the number who were sympathetic, sometimes outright supportive of Hitler and his agenda, like Henry Ford. Remember how anti-Semitic he was. Walt Disney, also known for his anti-Semitism at that time. Joseph Kennedy, who in 1938 was appointed the ambassador to Great Britain and spent a lot of time in Berlin meeting with Hitler. And Charles Lindbergh, whom I'm sure you've all heard of. Charles Lindbergh became famous in 1927 when he became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean without stopping. It took him 33 and a half hours. Now, he wasn't the first person to fly across the ocean. There had been a crew that had done so previously, but he was the first person to do it completely alone, and he was celebrated around the world. There he is standing with the plane in which he did this, the Spirit of St. Louis. He became probably one of, if not the most famous and beloved American heroes of his time. He was in the news again a few years later, 1932, when his infant son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., was kidnapped from the Lindbergh's home. And this was something that was all over the news as they were trying to find the baby. And ultimately, when they found the child, he was dead. So that was a tragedy. However, Lindbergh continued to be in the news after that in the late 1930s because of his outspoken isolationism, his outspoken opposition to the United States getting involved in any way in the war that was brewing and then that which eventually started in 1939 in Europe. And it went beyond that. He actually was one of those who was supportive of Hitler. And he, in various public speeches and editorials and opinion pieces that he wrote, expressed some extremely anti-Semitic views and made a lot of attacks on President Roosevelt, whom he considered to be a socialist, which he considered far, far dangerous than Hitler. An organization formed called the America First Committee that was anti-interventionist, right? So the fighting had started. This organization was made up of people who were against the U.S. going to war, but it was also pro-fascist. pro-Nazi, essentially. And Lindbergh was their principal spokesperson. Here are some political cartoons from the early 40s addressing isolationism by an artist you may have heard of, Theodore Geisel, alias Dr. Seuss. At this time, Dr. Seuss was not a children's book author. He hadn't done Horton Hears a Who yet, although he did not long after this, and achieved so much success that he eventually started doing that exclusively. At this time, he was working for a New York daily newspaper called PM that had kind of a liberal slant to it, and this pretty well shows you where his stance was on isolationism. On the left, there you've got Uncle Sam sleeping peacefully in his twin bed, and Europe is in the bed right next to his, and Europe's over there with all these illnesses like the Stalin itch, Hitleritis, the Blitzpox, Nazi fever, fascist fever, and the Italian mumps. Even the cat underneath the bed, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, is suffering from this. And Uncle Sam is saying, "What a lucky thing we've got separate beds." The point being, that's ridiculous, right? They're still close to one another, and he's still going to get sick. The point is that just because there's an ocean between the U.S. and Europe doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't going to be affected by all the things that are happening there. The other cartoon, you've got Lindbergh there in the lower left, and he's patting Hitler on the head. Hitler is kind of like a Loch Ness monster type creature whose head is popping up out of the water, but you don't have to look very closely to see that there's a whole lot of monster behind him. And Lindbergh is patting him on the head and smiling and saying, "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." And that, by the way, is a direct quote from one of Lindbergh's speeches. And here is another one with this lady reading her kids a scary bedtime story. And there on her shirt is Lindbergh's slogan, the pro-Nazi slogan, "America First." And she's saying, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter." Gee, it's a good thing people don't think like that anymore, huh?